Parramatta.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. Now, it was a very impassioned speech by the Shadow Treasurer, and we all know that the Shadow Treasurer has had a bit of trouble with his speeches over the last couple of years, with the small problem being that he hasn't got any policies up in Shadow Cabinet. Hasn't got any tax policies up, hasn't got any productivity policies up, no economic reforms, absolute donut. So in the absence of policies, what he does is he speaks in these airy generalisations about things that he calls principles. And he has a name for these principles. He calls them his back-to-basics principles. Wow. This is his back-to-basics economic approach. And every chance he gets, he tells us about the contents of his back-to-basics economic approach. Now, I don't think he knows how the kids are using the term basic these days. Nobody has had the heart to fill him in, but that's okay for the Shadow Treasurer. It's hip to be square. But the question is, what is in this back-to-basics approach? What are the principles that he holds so dear? Policy number one for him in these principles is smaller government. Principle number two that he talks about a lot is competitive neutrality. And principle number three is reducing regulation. So, Deputy Speaker, I thought I would just do, after a big week of coalition policy, I thought I'd just do a quick welfare check on how the back-to-basics approach was going. Let's go through them one by one. Number one, back-to-basics principle number one was smaller government, Deputy Speaker. Smaller government. That has not had a good week. Unfortunately, that one really hit the rocks when his leader announced the biggest government-funded program in Australian history. Wow. The Shadow Treasurer has spent 2 years about spending less. He's been complaining about the Housing Fund. He's been complaining about the NRF, all $10 billion of it, all these off-balance sheet funds that he says are a big waste of Australian taxpayers' money. Well, it turns out their problem wasn't that they were off-balance sheet. The problem was that they weren't big enough. Now he's got a $600 billion off-balance sheet proposal. Deputy Speaker, it's a beauty to behold, Deputy Speaker. It's 60 times bigger than the Housing Fund. It's 10 times bigger than the NBN. It's 4 times bigger than the biggest policy in Australian history of JobKeeper. That used to be the most expensive policy. It pales into comparison to the $600 billion they want to spend on nuclear energy. So Peter Dutton has completely junked the pretense at smaller government. He's taken back-to-basics principle number one outside and given it a shot to the back of the head.
I'm just going to remind you do need to use correct titles when referring.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. His economic policy, Deputy Speaker, is less back to basics now. It's more back to Bolsheviks. The Soviets would be proud of this, Deputy Speaker. They'd really love it. I mean, Stalin had a 5-year plan. The Shadow Treasurer's now got a 15-year plan. Brezhnev built 3 nuclear plants in 20 years. The Liberals want to build 7 in 10 years. This is about national ambition, Deputy Speaker. The Soviets weren't ambitious enough. They didn't have the vision, Deputy Speaker, that the Liberals have. OK, let's do a quick check on principle number 2. Energy policy must be competitively neutral. That's what we heard from the Shadow Treasurer, all about back to basics, not picking winners. Well, again, this principle really hit the fence last week. It hit the fence when that principle was junked by the mother of all captains' picks in energy policy. Nuclear power for all, Deputy Speaker. The Shadow Treasurer the week before was saying energy infrastructure has to be commercial. We don't want to subsidise. The private sector. His leader said, "No, let's put it on the government credit card." Rolled again, unfortunately, and back to basics principle number 2 disappears. Now, back to basics principle number 3, regulation. This one's my favourite, Deputy Speaker. Very passionate about this. He's the Shadow Treasurer, very passionate. He doesn't want the dead hand of government getting involved in business. He doesn't want government telling businesses what to do. They should be out there employing people, driving economic growth. That's what he needs businesses to do. That's why this is his important principle number 3 in back to basics is deregulation. Well, unfortunately, his leader had other ideas again. When it comes to grocery prices, his leader has put forward the most statist, the most socialist, the most big government, the most interventionist policy you could imagine. This policy made the Greens blush, Deputy Speaker. It was so socialist the Greens had second thoughts. He doesn't just want to regulate. He doesn't just want to regulate.
Sorry,
he wants to split them
you've got
up,
a
Deputy
point of
Speaker.